Hello, everyone. As you're taking your seats, I want to welcome you to the New School. My name is Teresa Ghilarducci. I'm a professor of economics here, and I head up the Bernard Schwartz Center on Economic Policy Analysis. And economic policy analysis is what we're here for today. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers, and our main speaker is Dr. Raphael Bostic, an economist I've been following for decades, and was delighted that you've become very important in economic policy making for the country. We could not be in better hands. He is the president of, his current position is the president of the Atlantic Federal Reserve Bank. He is also the Judith and John Bedrosian Chair in Governance and Public Enterprise at the Sol Price School of Public Policy. It's a lot of words. And it was right. He was, before he came into the Fed, at USC, at the University of Southern California. He had worked at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and served as an assistant secretary for policy development and research at the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development. Many don't know, but Professor Howell told me that we almost got you to work here at the New School, but the Fed had a better offer. But how could it be? Dr. Bostic has always been one of the most creative policy economists. As I said, I've been following him from decades. And I'm really glad you're here with us and hope you come often. Darrick Hamilton will be on the panel. He, as many of you know, is the Henry Cohen Professor of Economics and Urban Policy, and he's the founding director of a very important institute here at the New School, the Institute on Race, Power, and Political Economy. He is a pioneer in a new field of economics called economic stratification economics. It has its own code in the lexicon of fields, official fields in the economics profession. He is one of the most sought after lecturers in academics and in community spaces and in policy spaces. He is the father, the godfather, the godmother and mother of the baby bonds idea, and that idea, that policy idea is meant to be a means to close the wealth gap and to slow down the relentless and persistent wealth gaps caused by intergenerational transmission of wealth and of status. I look forward to hearing more, Darrick, about your federal job guarantee and your work on the human rights economy, and I hope we all can join that work. Kate Bahn wants to eradicate the scourge of monopsony labor markets everywhere in order to right the wrongs of overwhelming employer power. She is now the research director of WorkRise, which is a research to action network focused on jobs, workers, and mobility. And that organization is hosted by the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. For years, she hosted the Twitter handle of feminist economics, the only one around, called Lipstick Econ. Lorraine, you probably know that, Lipstick Econ. Kate is a very special person to me. She was one of my first graduate students here, a PhD student from our department, and she's worked with Darrick and me over the years and on her research. But you all should watch Kate Bahn, because it's her career that's going to rise, and you'll be all able to say, well, I met her when, on October 19th, she was at the New School. Tony James is my friend, my co-author, and internationally recognized global investor. He served as president and COO of the Blackstone Group. Tony heads Jefferson River Capital, and he heads the Costco board. He takes lead roles at the Metropolitan Art Museum, the Wildlife Conservation Society, Mount Sinai Hospital System, and other places. He founded the Partnership for Educational Advancement, and that foundation provides infrastructure to historically Black colleges and universities. And Tony helps us by helping the nation by serving on President Joe Biden's Intelligence Advisory Board. And last but not least, he co-authored Rescuing Retirement, a University of Columbia Press book with me, where we propose a solution to America's looming retirement crisis, born of the inequality of wealth. We are partners in detailing a policy path to right the wrongs of wealth inequality, and our solution is guaranteed and universal pensions for all Americans. And that's us. To set the table for today's lecture, I'd like to show you a few numbers. After all, you came to a presentation by 4 economists. This is right off the press, and it's work that we're doing at our institute, and it's very similar to the kind of work that Darrick is doing at his institute. We're very much on the same page. And this is the change in wealth by households broken out by race. If you believe that the house is where people save their money and get their wealth, you'd be wrong for most people. Since 1992 to 2016, the real value of home equity has fallen, mainly due to home equity, second mortgages, and HELOC loans. Retirement savings and benefits, despite $250 billion spent as tax breaks for those accounts, down for almost everybody. That last column is all the other races we haven't, and ethnicities we haven't identified, and those are mainly Asian households, a smaller population. So retirement savings hasn't performed, home equity hasn't performed, and other sources of wealth and debt has netted out, so many households have more debt than wealth over those 40 years. It's really broken. Our wealth building institutions, for at least these groups, for most people, is broken. Now we break it out in terms of just wealth class. And these are people who have lived their lives, play by the rules. These are all households that had some worker in them, and they're in their late 50s. They're about ready to retire or about ready to be pushed out of the labor force. So what did America's wealth building institutions do for them? Well, not so much. The house, again, for the bottom 50% of the population, hasn't done so well. These are medians, not averages, and medians tell the story, not averages. Social Security has even gone down, all but for the 10th. And that's because in 1983, the Reagan administration with Congress raised the retirement age, and that meant a cut to 10 to 15 to 20% in benefits. Retirement savings, though it was supposed to be democratized and everybody was supposed to be on their own and get a little financial education in 4th grade, a little tax breaks didn't work. We're worse off than we were in 1992. And because of the use of debt and credit cards and student debt, the very bottom is still in debt after those years. Middle class did a little bit better and other sources of wealth and debt, but the place where we think people accumulate their house and their retirement, it hasn't performed. So with that news, and as I set the table, we have someone in government who's also interested in these issues, but you might have plans to fix it. Raphael Bostic, will you come? And you need more room.
Yeah, I do need more room. I'll figure this
Can you
out.
find the room? Okay.
Oh, I'll just make the room for sure. Didn't work. That didn't work. So it's always an adventure to get my technology to work the way I want it to.
You might have a 14-year-old in the room.
No, this is the way I feel at home. So just about every talk I give, technology blows up at some point. I call it the curse. And so this not working the way I wanted it to was a sign that I'm very comfortable at home. I want to thank you, Professor Ghilarducci, for the kind introduction. And thanks to all of you here and everyone at the New School for inviting me to deliver the Schwartz Lecture. It really is an honor and a privilege. Now, I have some prepared remarks, and I wasn't going to talk about some things, but Teresa's introduction just got me to say I should say something. This is actually the first time I've been back on this campus since that interview for the job, a long time ago. I stopped calling out numbers because they're bigger than I want them to be. And I had a great visit here, and so it's really nice to finally be able to come back and see sort of how the university has become. I would also say that it is a great coincidence that Dr. Donna Shalala is the interim president. You probably don't know this, but President Shalala preceded me as Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And so in some regards, I am an heir of her great work, and she has been an important person in so many different ways, and I just want to thank you publicly for all that you've done, and for coming back here, because you didn't have to do this, but it is actually quite important. She was also president at the University of Miami, and was kind enough to let me visit with her. And at the time, you all know Flat Stanley? So one of my neighbors, Flat Stanley has this paper Stanley cutout, and they want the kids to take pictures of Stanley in all these places. So I took it, and we have a picture with Flat Stanley that became like the star thing in Pasadena, California. So thank you again for that. All right, so with all the informal stuff out of the way, let me get to my prepared remarks. I want to start by just saying that expanding economic opportunity is a defining issue of our time. Because of outright discrimination in some cases and unintended consequences in others, our nation has long squandered too much talent and too much creativity. And we must change this if we are going to continue to thrive as a people and as an economy. And that's why we at the Atlanta Fed several years ago embraced the pursuit of economic mobility and resilience. Now, in our building, folks call that EMAR. I don't really like acronyms, so I don't often say it. I'll say it one more time in these remarks. But it is our guiding strategy. EMAR is a guiding strategy for our bank, and it really we try to have that inform how we think about everything that we do. Now, today I will detail some of our bank's EMAR work, but I'm going to do that after I discuss the role that monetary policy plays, and importantly, the role that it also doesn't play in confronting economic disparities such as wealth inequality. My remarks will focus on monetary policy's effects on the labor market, as for most of us, a good job is a precondition to building wealth. I'll add that these are my thoughts alone. They don't necessarily reflect those of my colleagues in the Federal Reserve System or the Atlanta Fed. I got that done, so we're good now. I get in trouble if I always forget to do the disclaimer, and people yell at me. All right, so now I'm not going to spend the time a lot of time describing the state of wealth inequality in the United States. You know, Professor Ghilarducci outlined the situation well, and I think you all understand that it's been a grave problem for quite a long time, and it has defied quick fixes. Now, up front, I need to be clear that the Fed operates within a number of statutory constraints. Now, that means we cannot pursue certain activities. We cannot award grants. We cannot deliver ongoing services to families and communities, and we cannot directly lobby for particular policies. And that's just our reality. Now, the Fed's mandate from the Congress is to pursue price stability and maximum employment. You often hear Fed folks talk about the dual mandate. A superficial reading of the mandate might suggest that we not concern ourselves at all with economic disparities. After all, our core duty, which is monetary policy, influences the economy in extremely broad ways, and thus is not a direct remedy for economic inequalities. But I think such a reading would miss a larger point that stems from the maximum employment side of the mandate, which I often describe as sustained maximum employment. And let me explain. A quick workable definition of maximum employment says that we are charged with creating an environment in which everyone who wants a job can find one. In the shorter run, employment opportunities tend to be constrained by a person's education or training, their experience, the availability of jobs where they live, and so on. But over time, these circumstances can change. People may go to school, they can get training, they can gain new skills. So in the longer run, sustained maximum employment means everyone has the opportunity to get not just any job, but gainful employment in a job that is consistent with their full potential. To achieve sustainable maximum employment, we must foster an economy in which everyone can maximize their human capital and apply their talents to their highest and best use to earn family-supporting incomes. In short, sustainable maximum employment is a more inclusive objective. So, while monetary policy cannot granularly address persistent ills like wealth inequality, it has a role. And that role is linked to the dual mandate and grounded in the reality that economic disparities limit opportunity for millions of Americans. And limitations for workers limit employment, which limits the economic prospects of businesses, which in turn constrains local, regional, and national economies. Therefore, economic disparities are a concern and should be a concern of the Federal Reserve. Now, how do we address that concern within our statutory framework? Or since I've already described what we can't do, what can the Fed do? As I noted, monetary policy by nature is not suited to target conditions for particular populations or locations. Rather, monetary policy can help create broad conditions conducive to sustaining economic expansions. And that is where our policy can contribute to better labor market outcomes for those who are typically on the margins of the economy and on the short end of wealth inequality. So in that vein, I'd like to focus on the late 2010s and the years immediately preceding the pandemic. As some of you might recall, this period became part of the longest economic expansion in US history, as the fruits of a strong labor market eventually began to spread across the population. The unemployment rates for Black and Hispanic workers reached all-time lows, and the gaps between those rates and the white unemployment rate narrowed to their lowest levels on record. Now, the decline in Black unemployment was especially strong. In late 2019, it hit its lowest level since the Bureau of Labor Statistics began gathering the relevant data in 1972. And as Fed Chair Jerome Powell has pointed out, before the pandemic began, it appeared those gains would continue. Now, during those pre-pandemic years, the Federal Open Market Committee, or the FOMC, did not default to a policy approach that had proven quite effective over the previous 2 decades. And this was a formulation that very low employment inevitably leads to inflation. Instead, as unemployment kept falling but inflation remained subdued, the committee let the economy run. And these policy decisions were not obvious. They weren't obvious at the time, for sure. The main policy rate, the federal funds rate, stood at effectively 0 for 7 years as the economy limped out of the Great Recession. And even before the FOMC began liftoff and nudged the rate up in late 2015, various rules-based formulas suggested that the rate should be higher. It's a large literature trying to tell the Fed or figure out what the Fed's optimal rate would be, and these all have mathematical formulas. All of them said that we should not be where we were, should not have been where we were. And as a result, there were calls from outside the committee to remove policy accommodation sooner. And summaries of economic projections from that time suggest that committee members anticipated it would be appropriate to raise the federal funds rate sooner and more than it ended up ultimately doing. The committee moved the policy rate in December 2015 to a range of 0.25% to 0.5%. Now, just a year earlier, the median FOMC member projection figured that the appropriate rate should be 1% for 2015. By the end of 2016, the Fed funds rate target was still just 0.5% to 0.75%. Whereas the median projection a year earlier said that by the end of that year, it should be about 1.5%. So my point here, the committee was actually willing to adapt to changing economic conditions and reacted to incoming data rather than hewing to projections or long-held conventions about the connection between low unemployment and inflation. And the beneficiaries of that labor market that resulted from this approach were disproportionately the people in the groups on the wrong side of the nation's wealth divide. Now, I don't want to bog you down with too many numbers. People tell me all the time, economists put too many numbers around and we talk too much about this stuff, so I try not to do that. But I am going to point to a few data points that I think will help clarify how the FOMC is thinking on the relationship between unemployment and the threat of inflation have evolved. Now, first, a little background. Inflation forecasts typically have been based on estimates of what economists call the natural rate of unemployment, or U star, and how much upward pressure on prices results when the unemployment rate declines relative to that U star. And the further it declines relative to U star, the higher the pressure is on inflation. So basically, if you think about U star, it's the unemployment rate consistent in the longer run with the committee's 2% inflation objective. And you can think of this U star as the unemployment rate that will neither kindle inflation nor cause widespread disruption for households. Now, unfortunately, there's no observable measure of U star, but we estimate it the best that we can. In the late 2010s, as real unemployment dipped lower and lower, and inflation hardly budged, the committee started reducing its estimates of the natural unemployment rate. The median estimate from last month's FOMC meeting was 4%, and it was down from what it was 5.5% in January of 2012. And that was the last time the Fed updated its underlying monetary policy framework before 2020. Now, a difference of 1.5 percentage points over a decade may not sound like a big number, not a big deal. But based on the size of today's labor force, that gap would translate to about 2.5 million additional unemployed people. Had the committee not been willing to adapt to ever-changing evolution of the real economy, we would likely have raised interest rates sooner in the 2010s and perhaps snuffed out employment opportunities for many of our neighbors. As Powell said in his 2019 speech at Jackson Hole, since 2012, declining unemployment has had surprisingly little effect on inflation. Indeed, the unemployment rate fell from 10% in 2012 to under 4% when Powell said those words. The longest expansion on record produced an unemployment rate that hovered near 50-year lows for roughly 2 years, well below most estimates of what was sustainable. Labor force participation also climbed. Now, one of the reasons those things happened was that from 2010 through 2020, the FOMC never pushed the target for the Fed funds rate above a range of 2.25% to 2.5%, and inflation remained calm. Monetary policy helped sustain an economic expansion that over time disproportionately benefited people who traditionally are the last to enjoy the fruits of a growing economy. Now, how do we know this? Well, research tells us that long expansions disproportionately help traditionally marginalized workers. The literature has established that the Black unemployment rate declines faster than the white rate during expansions, but it also rises faster in downturns. And that appears to be especially true in the latter stages of economic growth cycles. One of our economists, Julie Hotchkiss, found that Black workers had just begun making material labor market gains in the late 2010s. In a 2021 paper, Hotchkiss shows that Black workers benefit disproportionately from the momentum of a recovery when the economy is unusually strong and the expansion lasts long enough to bring in those at the margins of the labor force. A 2019 paper by 4 Fed economists and published by the Brookings Institution found similar results. Now, on the other hand, research also shows that when the economy cools, disadvantaged workers on average suffer the sharpest setbacks. Hotchkiss, for instance, writes that the sudden onset of the COVID pandemic reversed much of the progress Black workers made in the late 2010s expansion. Now finally, a new working paper from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors finds that, not surprisingly, inequality in labor market outcomes between white and Black workers translates to a meaningful difference in welfare for the two types of households. A more novel finding from that work concerns the monetary policy framework the Fed adopted in August of 2020. Now, I'm not going to do a deep dive on the framework today, but the key for our discussion is that the framework commits the FOMC to set policy based on shortfalls in employment, whereas previously we zeroed in on deviations from employment, which of course would include periods when unsustainably low unemployment, so traditional theory held, threatened to spark inflation. This new research from the Board of Governors suggests that the shortfalls rule will bolster economic expansions by holding interest rates lower than they would have been under the previous approach. Specifically, under the new framework, the unemployment rate in a typical expansion will decline by about 0.7 percentage points, more than it would otherwise. Now, I'll quote directly from the paper here to avoid ambiguity. Even though the shortfalls rule still targets the aggregate unemployment rate gap, it has disproportionately larger benefits for Blacks than for whites in terms of unemployment rates. Now, let me reiterate here that these benefits accrue from lengthening the economic expansion, or lengthening any economic expansion, and not from any intervention aimed precisely at racial unemployment gaps. And monetary policy just doesn't do the latter, so it's good to see that the former can actually work. Now, to be sure, monetary policy is not solely, or perhaps even mainly, responsible for enhancing employment outcomes for disadvantaged workers. A notable factor of late is progress in educational attainment. Consider college degree attainment rates. You no doubt know that African Americans and Hispanic Americans have long lagged the general population in terms of earning college degrees. Well, between 2010 and 2020, gains in the share of African Americans and Hispanic Americans with college degrees far outpaced those for the general population. And this has direct implications for unemployment. As this slide illustrates, high school graduates who don't attend college experience substantially higher unemployment rates than do workers with degrees. In September, for example, the unemployment rates were 2.1% and 4.1% respectively for degree holders and workers with only a high school diploma among people 25 years of age or older. Now, of course, caveats apply, but generally speaking, more workers with more educations is good news on other fronts too. A report from the New York Fed shows that the median wages of bachelor's degree holders exceeded those of high school graduates by more than 50% in 2022, a ratio that has changed little over the past 3 decades. Now, I don't mean to suggest that every person should attend college. There are certainly other pathways to better labor market outcomes, such as training and apprenticeships. And in fact, the Atlanta Fed's Opportunity Occupations Monitor highlights many good jobs that one can attain through those routes. But college is a proven pathway that frequently leads to economic self-sufficiency and to wealth building. Now, I focused the policy portion of this speech on the pre-pandemic era because that was when we learned about a changed interaction of unemployment and inflation, and accordingly shifted our understanding of what I call maximum sustained employment in important ways. The 2020 framework codifies that our maximum employment mandate is inclusive. I think it's fair to interpret the underlying policy strategy as making sure that we do not preemptively curtail Make sure that we do not preemptively curtail the creation of jobs, in particular, jobs most likely to help low and moderate income and minority communities. Now, let me be clear on one other point, because some have put this forward as well. The 2020 framework did not inform monetary policy during the economic crisis brought on by the COVID pandemic. The waves of sickness, snarled global supply chains, lockdowns, and other public health and fiscal measures associated with the pandemic triggered a surge of inflation that contrasted sharply with the low inflation environment contemplated by the shortfalls language of the framework. Like central banks all around the world, the Fed had no choice but to decisively confront this heightened inflation to prevent an even longer and more debilitating period of intense price pressures. Avoiding preemption of job creation was never a consideration. Inflation was job one. Getting that under control was job one. Now, I've talked at length about monetary policy. That's the well-known work of the Federal Reserve. You may not know that also in pursuit of sustained maximum employment, we spend considerable energy trying to identify barriers to full labor market participation and work with partners in the relevant fields to try to help reduce or eliminate those barriers. Now, I'd like to highlight one particular program at our bank. I could actually talk about this for probably 3 hours, so I'm going to spare you that today. Several years ago, a team of community development specialists and economists launched a research and advisory enterprise we call the Advancing Careers for Low-Income Families Initiative. Advancing Careers aims to provide information and data to workers, to employers, and community and state leaders so that workers can make better career decisions, employers can meet their talent needs, and leaders can help advance family economic mobility and resilience. The initiative focuses on benefits cliffs that occur when a wage earner who receives multiple public benefits, you can think about SNAP or Medicaid and so on, when they start to earn more income, but winds up being less well off because they exceed income eligibility thresholds for those benefits and thus lose access to them. Our team concluded that benefits cliffs constitute a punitive marginal tax on many of our fellow citizens, and many of them are the ones who can least afford it. Basically, someone might earn an extra $1, but lose $3 or $4 in public benefits. So consequently, benefits cliffs become a perverse incentive for low-wage earners, and the incentive is to not gain new skills, to not try to climb a career ladder. It's because, and our research has shown this, it typically takes a decade or more for that additional income to exceed the lost benefits. So that break-even point is 10 years, 12 years, 15 years down the road. Now, the people who are potentially affected by this, they totally get it. They're not dumb, and therefore they often forego training and don't try to get that better job. Now, a key finding from our Advancing Careers team's work is that investing public resources to mitigate that cliff, basically to tide people over by raising income thresholds, for instance, saves communities money in the long run. Let me say that again. Investing in public resources to mitigate the cliff, tiding people over while they're making themselves better off, positioning themselves to get those better earnings, saves money for the communities in which they live. For one, over the long term, there's less outlay on public benefits because workers pursue career paths that allow them to stand on their own financially. And the research also shows that tax collections rise. As more citizens earn family supporting incomes, they pay income taxes and consume more goods and services. Now, I'll share a quick story about the real world value of this kind of objective research. And this story demonstrates that even in today's hypercharged political environment, policies to mitigate benefits cliffs are achievable and in some cases uncontroversial. This year, both chambers of the Florida legislature unanimously passed a law expanding eligibility standards for the state's publicly funded Children's Health Insurance Program, or CHIP. Starting in January 1st of 2024, families can earn up to 300% of federal poverty level income, up from the previous threshold of 200%, and still qualify for the CHIP program. Now, Florida officials used analytical tools developed by our Advancing Careers team to clarify that the health insurance program was indeed creating benefits cliffs for too many Florida workers. And for some families, the 200% income cutoff meant that a modest wage increase could result in annual health insurance premiums soaring from around $240 to over $3,000. Now, our Advancing Careers team figures the impending eligibility expansion can increase families' net financial resources as their earnings rise, and in the long run, better position those families to build self-sufficiency and wealth. Now, let me be explicit here and point out that we did not lobby for this policy shift. As I said earlier, the Fed doesn't do lobbying. I got to make sure everybody leaves here knowing that we didn't do that. Rather, our tool allowed policymakers to get objective information that informed their thinking about the issue and ultimately led them to pursue a policy change. Let me conclude back where I began with monetary policy. In important ways, the pandemic emergency and inflation outbreak blew up the policy formulation that served to lengthen the pre-pandemic economic expansion, just as it upended the entire macroeconomy. Yet, the understanding we absorbed in the final years of the pre-pandemic expansion remains with us and will continue to inform my policy thinking. As for inflation, that is job one for now. I usually start every talk I do, inflation is high, it's too high, and we have to get it under control. I didn't do that today, but I got my lines in anyway, all right. Now, as part of the work that undergirds the 2020 framework, we conducted numerous public events to gather input from a broad range of researchers, citizens, representatives of low and moderate income communities, employers, and elected officials. And a message that endures from those sessions was that people want us to tackle inflation, that high inflation is more important, is more debilitating, is more costly, more painful, and it drives people more aggressively to precariousness. So if we don't get this under control, there's going to be a bigger and broader problem, and that's why it's job one. And we heard clearly that 2 or 3 extra points of inflation, while it may, in many circumstances, save 1/10 of a percentage point in unemployment, on net, it is a loss for the populations on the wrong side of the wealth imbalance. So looking ahead, after the COVID emergency fully passes, the world will have changed in ways that we can't yet fully grasp. So I can't say with certainty that I will resume precisely the same modes of thinking about monetary policy that informed my views during the long expansion. But what I can say is that the experience of those pre-pandemic years will inform tomorrow's mindset as the committee continues working to create an economic foundation that serves all Americans. With that, I hope you have a better sense of how the Atlanta Fed and Federal Reserve System approach issues of economic disparities. Even as these concerns rightly garner increased attention, in important respects, a consensus around the best ways to address disparities remains elusive. And what this means is that researchers like the folks in this room and the folks on this campus have a vital role to play in marshaling evidence so that policy is informed by sound information rather than stubborn misconceptions. I know my discussants today, all thought leaders on campus here and beyond, have been active in this pursuit and have much to say on it. Wealth inequality in our country has been over a century in the making. It won't dissipate quickly. There is much to do, and much can go wrong. But I'm optimistic because we're having the right conversations, smart people are doing important research and practical work, and there's a real appetite for change. I look forward to tackling these critical problems together. That'll be the end of my prepared remarks. Please do connect with us. We do a lot of neat things, and I'm looking forward to the comments from the panel. Thank you very much.
You now have found the cards and the pencil on your chairs. That's to write questions for either Raphael or for the panelists after you hear our discussion? Seeing some nice students walk in. Thanks for coming. Well, that was terrific remark. Those were terrific remarks. And I think I'd like to start by just asking each of you, and I'll start with you, Darrick. Given the weight of inequality in our society and the current places where we are in the business cycle, is the Fed doing enough given what it can or what it says it can?
No.
Yeah, right. Really?
Well, first, gratitude. Gratitude for hosting this event. Gratitude to President Bostic for his outstanding remarks. And even some context. I mean, we're at a moment in history where not only do we have him leading the Atlanta Fed, we also have Susan Collins at the Boston Fed, and Lisa Cook and Philip Jefferson on the Federal Reserve Board. And that's not common that we have that type of representation leading these powerful institutions. And why is that important? Not only is representation in and of itself important, but they bring perspective and care to redress certain issues that we might not otherwise have. The backgrounds, the neighborhoods they grew up in, the families from which they stem from, probably not only encourage, require them to tackle some of these issues that would hit a wider swath of Americans. So that should really be commended. Is the Fed doing enough? Well, I would say no. I think there's no question there are constraints in what the Fed can do, particularly relative to the federal government with regards to redressing inequality. But I think the normative perspective of price stability is overemphasized at the expense of ensuring that we have greater inclusion in our economy. Without a doubt, when there is high levels of inflation, there's necessary intervention to take place. So the inflation that we experienced after literally stopping economic activity and then starting it back up was not unexpected. But what it was not was structural inflation. The causes of structural inflation usually are some manipulation by some entity that might even be hostile to the U.S. economy. But the U.S. always maintained its sovereign monetary power, so the capability of redressing inflation was there. But of course, this is not apolitical. There was political gaslighting around inflation that very well spilt over into some of our fiscal interventions that could have affected inclusion in general. I'll say a couple other things about the expansionary period. Well, if we also put this in context, it was long. It was a long, although it was a long expansion, it was a gradual expansion, and some people called it an oxymoronic scenario of jobless recovery. So a couple of things happened. It was a long period, a long, steady downward slope in unemployment, but the nature of work also changed during that period. So consistent with President Bostic's narrative of not just saying unemployment, but sustainable employment, the nature of work is different today than it was prior to the last Great Recession. So a job just isn't a job. We should recognize that. And there needs to be an emphasis on good jobs. Last thing I want to say, and then I talked a lot and probably didn't answer your question directly. Let's also add the context of skill as an input to providing mobility and economic inclusion, particularly across race. Without a doubt, more education leads to better jobs, better income, higher, actually, I'm not so sure about higher wealth. I think capital is the foundation for wealth. But without a doubt, more education is good. And it's good in and of itself. We want to live in a society where people have access to education in and of itself as an outcome. But that said, when we look across race, black people get a lower bang for higher education than white people do. And that is demonstrated in virtually every economic indicator that one can look at. And what's more, it costs black people more to go to college than it does white people because of an existing racial wealth gap. So it's more costly and they get a lower return. Yet, of course, I would advocate for greater education for black people, and there's policy intervention we need to do to ensure that. And then one other data point to keep in mind, or one other phenomena to keep in mind, that higher cost and lower return becomes amplified during economic downturns. So, I'm saying this in that if our hopes is to put everything on educational attainment to redress inequality, I don't think that's the right solution. So finally, to answer the question, I would say that there's a lot that the Fed can and does do. In addition to interest rates more broadly, they manage banks. The Fed is not only a public bank, it is the people's bank. It is also the bank of banks. And through that intervention, there are ways in which they can have distributionally perhaps better outcome and facilitate better environments than the blunt instrument for which we're all familiar.
All right, thank you. Tony, about the same question, and Pat, if you want.
Is the Fed doing enough to address inequality?
Yeah.
Can't remember the question. Thanks,
Yeah,
Darrick.
But you can add context.
I think Darrick made some good points. For me, the Fed has two dominant goals: full employment and keeping inflation under control. And I think that's his mandate. And I think it's dangerous for the Fed to try to do too much outside that mandate. So for me, it's got at least one hand tied behind his back in addressing inequality, maybe two. And I don't think Dr. Bostic said that this was a solution enough, but I think his point was the Fed can make a contribution. I'm a big believer in jobs and and getting people on the career ladder where they develop more skills, and it's not just income and taxes, what Dr. Bostic talked about. It's also dignity and a lot of other things that I think are critically important. So I'm all for the Fed erring on the side of jobs. When I've said that to friends of mine in the administration, they say, you don't get it. Inflation is more painful than you know for people at the low end of the income scale. So I don't want to. I'm kind of where Darrick was in terms of emphasizing jobs over inflation, but I want to be sure I'm not being insensitive, and I'm afraid we might both be a little bit on that. And I think one of the things, Dr. Bostic said we lengthened the expansion, and that was very good for employment of low-income people. Absolutely right. But now it is arguable that may have been the seeds for some of the severe inflation we're seeing now. And that's where you can see the Fed's hands being tied. There are other structural factors, perhaps. Darrick probably has some kind of conspiracy theory that I'm not appreciating. But I can tell you from the financial community, for a long time, they said the Fed doesn't get it. Inflation is here to stay. It is structural, and they need to be doing something. And they were late, and they got there on there too late. So that's a difficult thing for the Fed to balance. I believe. I think the impact. I thought there was some interesting statistics that came out from the Fed yesterday on its survey of consumer finances, where it showed that wealth really increased much more at the low and the high end, which is a little bit. Wealth is the accumulation of income over time and other things, but I think that's what Dr. Bostic was saying. The income and employment statistics he showed through through the late 2010s, I believe he called it, are now reflecting the wealth statistics. So you guys probably saw that, but African American wealth increased in the last 3 years 60%. White wealth increased 30%. Is there a gap? Absolutely. But progress, you can see I think Darrick's maybe said, I'm not sure incomes translate to wealth. I actually think the recent Fed study shows that it's being reflected in wealth. By the way, the average net worth of the bottom 10% increased 900%, and of the top 10% increased 26%. So there are a lot of ways of looking at, in this study that came out yesterday, a lot of ways of looking at the wealth effect, which shows that what Dr. Bostic was saying, income jobs has a benefit, which is, of course, just common sense. Now, I won't get in, if we're going to comment later on things like education, which Darrick got into, and other policy prescriptions, I have some views on that. They're slightly different from what Darrick was saying, but maybe we should wait on that, and I should give Kate a chance.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you so much also for having me here. The way I ended up here was I asked Teresa if I could come to the dinner afterwards so I could get my train ticket reimbursed. And now I'm on this panel. But it's really great to be here, and I'm really honored to be on this panel and to be discussing Dr. Bostic's remarks. And I want to sort of start really stepping back for a second and just appreciating how huge it is that the Federal Reserve is saying that inequality is bad for the economy. I think that's actually major. I think that's actually huge in economics. That goes against a lot of what we are taught in economics. Inequality is not some incentive for people to work harder and move up. It's actually a constraint and a barrier to people being able to do that. And so I think that framework alone is really, really important, and I want to just emphasize that point. But I don't know where to go here for jobs or inflation, because there's a lot of both there, and I don't think we have time to get through everything. But I'll start with jobs. I'll start on full employment, because I'm a labor economist, and that's a lot of what I know about. And so the maximum employment mandate, or sort of maximum sustained employment mandate, I think I align a lot with Darrick that education is necessary but not sufficient. And in particular, that graph with education and unemployment, I think we do know that higher education levels are more likely to be employed, but what kind of jobs are they in? So I really care a lot about job quality, worker mobility, what jobs are they getting into? And on the education too, I had a note here to say something similarly, that education also costs a lot. It could actually be an inhibitor to mobility if people are stuck in debt from trying to get higher levels of education. And so I think is when trying to achieve that dual mandate, we really need a critical lens on how full employment is achieved. And so a lot of my work that Teresa had referenced is on monopsony, where we look at how do workers match into the jobs they match into, and what does that mean for what happens to workers when they're in those jobs. And so monopsony is sort of basically any time the labor market is not competitive. And so maybe workers are getting into jobs, but they're not really great jobs because they don't have great other options. There's a wide variety of reasons this happens. The classic one is concentrated labor markets, but it also happens anytime that workers don't have good information on jobs. It happens anytime that there's mobility constraints that might just be not only sort of geographically, there's one dominant employer, but even within cities, it's hard to get around cities if you have care responsibilities. You need to be near a school. I think these mobility constraints are a little more narrow than people even recognize. And then finally, idiosyncratic preferences is how economists would call it, that there's sort of a variety of preferences that are hard to reveal, but those are really often constraints. And so that example of a mother who needs to be near a school so she can do pickups or work a certain schedule, an economist would call that an idiosyncratic preference, but that is actually a constraint. Or the other factor I think of is a black worker in a hostile work environment. They don't want to work in a hostile work environment. They may be changing jobs just to get away from that hostile work environment. It's not the scenario we think of where someone's switching jobs to get higher pay, but they're just switching jobs to get away from bad work environments. And so I think all of these things, there's increasing evidence that this is really pervasive across the economy. Workers don't appear to be as pay sensitive as we'd think in a competitive market, and so they're getting into bad jobs. They don't have upward mobility. And I think a key point of this is that this results in economic rents, and so it's not an effective use of economic value for there to be higher profits to undercut workers. And so I think, is the Fed doing enough? That was the actual question. Yeah. I actually think yes, and I think the Fed has done a really good job with particularly going through what's happened, but that is the foundation. I think that's really, monetary policy can only ever be a foundation. I think fiscal policy is where we really leverage that to have better outcomes for workers. And so I think, that sustained pressure from monetary policy to maintain a hot economy has to be there in the first place, but there's a whole lot more to do after that.
Wow.
Teresa, could I just address education, because both Darrick and Kate raised it, and I have a slightly different view. I'm not so sure the ROI on higher education is as good as it's made out to be in some of those statistics. and it's getting worse. Cost of higher education is going through the roof. And people are smart. Collectively, people are very smart. And that's why college enrollment in the United States is declining, and it's declining fairly rapidly in the most accessible colleges. 6% in community colleges per year is declining. And I'm not so sure general higher education, when I look at, that may not be the right choice for everyone. Nursing schools, for example, and things like that might lead to much better income outcomes. Where they lead to better life outcomes, people will have to decide. But I think there's a lot of alternatives which deserve more serious thought and research and so on in these discussions. I also think a lot of the data we see compares the outcome of college graduates with non-college graduates or with high school graduates. There's a big gap, especially for African Americans, between entering college and graduating college. The graduation rates are pathetically low, honestly, and those people are the worse off. You leave high school, you borrow a bunch of money, you stay out of the job market, you don't earn any money, and you don't graduate, and now you got all the debt and none of the degree, and it's terrible. And so I think, and I'm passionate about one segment of higher education, which is historically black colleges and universities, as you might have mentioned. But if you look at those, HBCUs enroll 9% of African Americans kids in college. They graduate about 18%, much better persistency getting to graduation, much better. And then an HBCU graduate on average earns 50% higher lifetime income, 50% higher than a black graduate from a predominantly white institution. And they're cheaper. So the ROI and the chance of success is much, much higher. And I think the drive to we've got to unpack education. It's not like one size fits all, and look at certain kinds of education, post-high school education, and certain kinds of institutions, and then make some calls. But I think it's too sweeping otherwise.
Yeah, sure.
Without a doubt, HBCUs historically and contemporary punch above their weight. They're under-resourced, and they provide empathy. They provide stereotype-safe environments that facilitate the education of black people. Also, the number one reason that black people that start college that don't graduate is finance. And that's embedded and structural in the American economy from its inception. So that we got to come up with the causal reason as to why. It's not a deficit amongst them, it's a deficit amongst our society. And I think you agree with that. I know we're not in debate over that. Then I'll say ROI is the wrong way to think about education. And if we lead with the first question that we should begin all conversations about economics with, which is, what is the purpose of an economy? If the purpose of an economy is to facilitate people to be self-determining and productive in ways that are righteous, then education in and of itself should be something that's afforded to them as the outcome. We've perhaps put too much emphasis on the returns to education in a profitable or business sense than what we should. So I just want to make that point. Then a couple of other things. That report that just came out by the Fed using a survey of consumer finance data is misleading. So the rate of growth of wealth amongst blacks has been higher than that amongst white, but the gap has risen. The gap has risen. So it's misleading to present ratios without an understanding of the gap. It would make sense that the ratios would get smaller. It's just where you begin in the distribution of wealth to begin with. If you have $1 and get $1, your income goes up by 100%. So that point should be it's a problem. If we don't get that stuff right, then we become misleading. And then, last thing I'll just say is inflation is clearly not structural because the Fed has done a good job to get it under control. I think inflation today is not the sky is falling. So this was not an example of structural inflation. This was an example of inflation that resulted from profit gouging, that resulted from rigidities associated with supply chains, and resulted from the simple fact that there was a huge government expenditure for which I'm willing to live with some inflation. At the end, what we should be concerned about is real wages in a distributionally inclusive way. There will always be winners and losers with price stability, and there are ways in which to think about the distributional impact of that price stability, and the Fed needs to be purposeful in that.
Okay, so now we'll go to Kate, but we're on the subject of the causes and remedies of inflation, and the possible trade-offs there may be with good jobs. I also hope that you all appreciate what you have here. We have economists, financiers here from the private sector, from the not-for-profit sector, from academia, and from government. And this doesn't happen that often. And we're now talking about some of the most, actually the most important issues in any kind of economic policy. So Kate, the relationship, the causes of inflation, workers, and the remedies.
Sure.
Unemployment.
And I also I appreciate Tony's point earlier that economists tend to be a little insensitive about inflation. I think that's absolutely true. I live with a real person who's not an economist, and I ask him, "Do you care about inflation? Why?" And like he does care about inflation because he's a business owner who cares about buying products. I think one thing that's hard for people with inflation is that it's hard to recognize that it is a wealth redistribution. It's a wealth redistribution from lenders to borrowers. Those types of effects are really hard to incorporate in our mental map. I think of the Bob Shiller paper from the 90s around why people hate inflation so much. I think a lot of it is that it seems like it comes from above. We know, me as a worker, I know I'm not the cause of inflation as an individual. If I lose my job, though, even in a recession, I do internalize that. Or if I get a good job, it's because I think I'm really good at a job and I should get hired in that. Jared Bernstein had said a few weeks ago, too, he talked about the idea of a personal price vector, that we just sort of need to update our personal price vector, even though we're in a period of deflation. People want prices to be what they were prior to inflation, which is not how it works. Disinflation would be terrible.
Just a little bit slower.
Yeah, sorry, I'm
hard.
yeah,
For you.
I get excited and I talk too quickly. So Jared Bernstein talked about a personal price vector. So just how much we think prices should be, we update that over time. I think of like, my Nana complained about the price of tolls all the time. She would always say it was a nickel when I was driving initially, and now it's $1. People have a really hard time updating what they think prices should be, and they want prices to be what they were in 2019. That's never going to happen. We do have deflation now, and we have real wage growth, particularly at the bottom, but people still want inflation to be what it was 3 years ago. If that happened, disinflation would be terrible for the economy in a whole other variety of ways. But how do we understand inflation now? A lot of the work I'm relying on, I'm not a macroeconomist, is thinking about sort of the relevance of the Phillips curve, this relationship between unemployment and inflation. And I think of the paper by David Ratner and Jay Sim, Is the Phillips Curve Dead? A Murder Mystery? Or Who Killed the Phillips Curve? A Murder Mystery. It's a really good paper. They work at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. And what they find is that due to declining worker power, which they explicitly note is the result of policy choices and choices made in the business community. This is not a natural thing that happened. It was choices people made to decrease worker power. And in that scenario where workers do not have power, the Phillips curve becomes flat. That relationship becomes flat. And it is not that mental map or sort of that framework that the Fed uses is not as relevant in a world with declining worker power. And in my area of research on monopsony, where there's not competition, there's even some evidence that perhaps the Phillips curve becomes inverted. It works the wrong direction, and so it would have perverse effects by raising or decreasing interest rates than what we expect. And so I think in this framework, inflation, I think I agree with Darrick that it's sellers' inflation is probably the cause of it, but how do we actually get people to a world where they're not unhappy about inflation, it's not impacting their budgets as much, is probably that other side of the equation around worker power and making sure that they are not being undercut by their employers, that they can demand wage increases that are commensurate with the profit increases that companies are seeing.
I think it's your turn.
My turn?
Phillips curve, did you kill it?
So the question is what's the
causes of inflation?
And Phillips curve, it was brought up. There's a lot of jargon. There's a lot of terms. Economists in general present the endeavor as if it's scientific. The Phillips curve becomes one of those. There's nothing scientific about the Phillips curve. It's relational. It sometimes is accurate, other times it is not. But it got presented, and Kate brings up a lot of good examples of the normative aspects as if it was science, pure science, and it's not. But there's a lot of terms that come out of the Fed. The natural rate of unemployment. There's nothing natural about the rate of unemployment. It is a normative choice that we choose to accept, to tolerate some level of unemployment and under certain conditions at a certain point in time. But it's not natural, and that's important to know. Another one, what is it, NARU? The non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. Again, we should recognize that a lot of this is political, and being presented as science leads us in a way where we can't combat it or respond to it. It just becomes it. As to the cause of inflation, there were many. Clearly, there was profiteering, but many causes. But I think the big story is that what we did in this last pandemic was tremendous. The fact that we're not in a Great Depression right now is mind-boggling. We literally ceased economic activity to save people's lives, and were able to get to the point where we were by large government interjection of fiscal spending into the economy directly. If that led to some levels of inflation, it's something I'm willing to live with. And again, that's not meant to be insensitive to the pain that was borne by various families, but look at what we gained. And then here's the political aspect. Things like a refundable child tax credit from the fiscal side got taken off the table with the jargon of a bill, and this was not Biden's doing, this was political apparatus, but the bill is, what is the title of the bill? Inflation Reduction Act, right? And words are important, norms are important, and I guess that's the point I want to get across right now, is that inflation was used as a gaslighting term to prevent us in a fiscal way to get to a better economy which would have been more inclusive.
Well, I guess that's where we can go. Tony, did you think there was too inflationary before the pandemic, with the Fed keeping interest rates low, and then the massive infusions of unemployment, extra benefits of unemployment, the stimulus checks, etc.?
I'm not sure the question. We had a really long, sustained growth period with low inflation and high employment, which was fantastic. Period, full stop. At the end, we had a burst of inflation, and maybe I'm not an economist, I don't understand structural inflation or not, but to me it was structural because it wasn't just companies pricing. There were things like shortages and things, and commodity inputs which went through the roof, so it took on a life of its own. I'm certainly not blaming workers for it, but I do think it started running hot before the Fed reacted for probably a year, when a lot of people were saying it's running hot, the Fed should react. And I think the Fed was somewhat slow, maybe not the Atlanta Bank. But a lot of people are saying, well, profiteering and so on and so forth. There's no two ways about that. Certain companies jacked up prices a lot, and that contributed to inflation. And you read about things like some of the consumer products food whose unit volumes were down 1% and their sales were up 14%, and it tells you something, right? I mean, but at the same time, if you look at a lot of the lower end service businesses, restaurants, hospitals, healthcare, their cost of labor has squeezed their margins, and they're actually making a lot less today. So, and in fact, I'm very involved in the largest hospital system in New York, Mount Sinai Hospital. We're getting crushed by higher labor costs in the sense that we're gonna lose $450 million this year, which if we do that 2 more years, we're out of business, and it's the largest hospital system in New York. And it's very, very much driven by the by the huge increase that we've had to pay in labor costs. And of course, we don't, 2/3 of our patients are Medicare and Medicaid, and we can't price up. So, and if you talk to restaurant owners and small service businesses like that, they're not swimming in tons of money right now. So I think it depends a lot on which segment. When you say that, you know, it's corporate or it's profiteering, I think it depends on a lot of, there's some of that for sure, but it depends a lot on what segment of the economy you're looking at. And I think it's like so many of these things, it's very dangerous to talk in generalities. I'm not even sure what the question is, so I'm just kind of talking. But I think, I mean, as I say, the political people in the White House and the Obama Foundation, where I'm very close, tell me that inflation hurts less privileged people a lot, and we need to be more sensitive to that. And it has a political consequence in terms of how they vote. I personally think the president's done a good job and has navigated the economy, good job, but he gets very low marks for stewarding the economy. And it can't be wage rates because they're up a lot. It can't be employment because unemployment is low. It has to be inflation. That's the only thing you could poke in him about. And it tells you, and all the surveys show that he's got very low approval ratings on his stewardship of the economy. Therefore, you can't conclude anything except that inflation people really do care about it, and therefore they care about it and don't feel it, or think of human beings, they care about it and they feel it. And I'm more in that people care about what they feel. So I think inflation is something we have to manage, but I don't know if
I
insightful.
did answer the question. I think Kate has the last word on the panel because we want to take questions from the audience and bring back Dr. Bostic, but stay there just in case some questions are pointed at you. So, Kate, it looks like the economists are a little lukewarm on the harms of inflation, except for the redistribution aspects for it. But the voters are really not lukewarm. They're in fact super hot, on inflation. How do you deal with that political economy aspect of the kind of fix the Fed could be in?
I mean, that is a really good question. I'm not even sure if I have a good answer. I have more explanations for why I think people hate inflation that I've been thinking about. And I've been thinking about wage convergence in particular. We know wages have come up at the bottom. We also know people who are doing well, when people below them come up, they think that that's a personal loss to them, and particularly around race issues too. People think, if they think that black workers are doing better, they believe that that is a loss to white workers. And so that doesn't totally answer your question, but I think it is some of it is social psychology, so I don't know if economists or political economists should even be answering these questions. I think a lot of it is social psychology, that what do you do about political economy or messaging or comms? It's something else, I think, beyond even what economists are capable of doing.
Okay, well, thank you.
Yeah.
Stay right there in case you're under fire. We have questions. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I'm going to moderate them. It turns out if you're in the middle of New York, it's best for people to write down the questions.
That's true in Atlanta too.
Dr. Bostic, does the Fed still believe in the Phillips curve? That if you run the economy too hot, that workers will get too much power and those wages will push up prices, and therefore the tried and true remedy is to slow down the economy, cause a little bit of softness in the labor market, and thereby bring down prices.
So
if you don't believe that.
Did they write all that on the card? That was a lot on the card. So let me answer this in a slightly different way. There's a lot of discussion about, is there a tension between wages / unemployment and inflation? And I think that what we've learned is that there can be, but sometimes there may not be. I'll just think about like the current environment. So the current environment, if you listen to any kind of media things, you know that people have talked a lot about a wage price spiral. That there's this theory that says that if wages go up, that's an increase in cost to a producer, And if the producer wants to keep their profit margins the same, then they gotta increase the price in the marketplace. But if the worker sees the price up in the marketplace, then they need more income to be able to do the same things that they did before. So they're gonna want prices to go up more. We have not seen any of that over the last year and a half. And what we have seen rather is that as inflation has happened, wages have gone up, but mainly because employers want to keep their workers. If the workers all know they're falling behind, they see it every day. And if the employers don't respond, then you will not have workers, and things will be worse for them. Right, so in this instance, wages, and what we've heard, and we asked this question a lot, wages are a lagging indicator. Right? And if you're in that kind of environment, then the Phillips curve conversation isn't actually the right conversation to have. We're actually focused on a different kind of dynamic. Right? And so one of the things that we try to do very, very deeply and carefully is talk to people, like regularly, to find out why they're doing the things that they're doing. Because, in every economic theory, there are a bunch of assumptions underneath them. There are a bunch of unspoken things that turn out to actually be really important for the relationship to hold. And if those underlying things don't hold, then the theory is not actually the one you should be talking about. And so I have a whole team, their job is actually go out and just talk to people. Everyone thinks about the Fed as we just sit and run regressions. No, we actually talk to people too. And part of this is because in real time, well, two reasons. One, most of the data that we get is backward looking, right? And we're trying to predict the future. Right, so if we can get some information about what's going to happen, that's useful. And so we do surveys to try to answer that. We talk to people and try to ask, why are you doing, what are you expecting you're gonna do 6 months from now? What are you seeing today that's gonna affect your decisions tomorrow? That's important as well. But the other piece is the motivations matter. Kate, you talked about psychology. I was a psych major, totally by accident. But it really does help to remind me and all of us that what people do in the marketplace is driven a lot by how they're feeling, what they're thinking, what happened yesterday. Like, all those things matter. And if you're not talking to folks to understand those things, you could draw the wrong conclusion. Like, the same action could mean 4 different things depending on what their mindset was at the time. And we need to know that. And so we try to know that. So I didn't really answer the question to say all of the above. But it just depends, and part of doing good policy, I think, is having a sensitivity to the nuance, looking for the nuance, and then trying to speak to it and incorporate that into your thinking about where policy should be.
Okay, these come from Professor Setterfield's
that's
macro
fine.
class.
That's fine.
Just walked out. No, I think it's from the students, but these are all on the card.
Okay, I see there's a lot of writing on these cards. So.
What measures, besides causing a recession by raising interest rates, could the Fed do to curb inflation that we're sensitive to? Could it use selective price controls, or would you direct Congress to do price controls? Would you goose output in some way? Would you have an excess profits tax? Would you have emergency supply channel relief? Would you advocate for actually targeting what what interest rates would rise or not rise? There you go, that's enough.
So that's a lot. One of the first things I was told when I took this job was never tell Congress what to do. Yeah. And so I don't do that. So what I try to do is just make sure that I'm on top of what I'm supposed to do, and make sure that I understand the implications of what I do. And so in this instance, I'm trying to get inflation to 2%. I'm trying to do it with as little damage to employment as possible. I think we can accomplish that, but it will take care and nuance. This is not easy. This is a large economy. There are lots of moving parts, and we need to be just paying a lot of attention. And as the world has accelerated in terms of change, so the pace of change, the pandemic was a crazy time, right? It seemed like every week we got new information, every week we got new learnings, every week someone was deciding new things. And how you incorporate that new information into a policy that's that has like a 3 and 5 year arc to it is hard. Right? That's hard. And so we spend a lot of time wrestling on these things. These are not straightforward. What I will say to this question is that one of the things that we really try to do as we go around and talk to folks, we hear barriers, we hear constraints, we hear things that aren't working, we hear where people are worried or are not feeling comfortable. I feel it's my obligation to tell every policymaker that I see those things, so that in case they're not hearing it, they know the set of things that they should be thinking about and have on their list of things to consider. What actually happens in a state house or in Washington, like, I'm not in those rooms. I don't make those decisions. But what I do know is that when I leave the room, they know the things that I'm hearing are the biggest things. And I think that's another important function that we can have.
I'm going to ask you one more question and then go from Kate first on down, and you'll have the last word. And it is that, just so you prepare, what's the one big thing? You know, where would you spend your first dollar? Where are you going to spend your first unit of effort? And then asking you, of all the things you've done at the Fed, when you leave that room, what do you want to leave behind? But one more question from the audience, and that is, would establishing a facility at the Fed to accept deposits from the public into individual accounts, to be the banks to the people, and would that help curb abuses by banks and thereby promote equality?
So there's a lot in that question.
It's on the card.
Yeah, no, I believe that. Here, let me say this. I actually think, and I'm going to say something I say all the time. I actually like banks. I think they provide an important service to the United States, to communities all over the country. And if you look at my district, right, I got a bunch of big cities, I got a bunch of small towns. Like if you just map Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Tennessee, small towns all over the place. And who serves most of those small towns? They're banks, right? The banks do the small business lending, they do the investment in the ball fields, they fund the local community center, like all those. Banks are actually important organizations. We need them. We need them to be good at what they do, and we need them to be alive tomorrow. Right? So those are all really important things. Now, the Fed we're having a lot of conversations about tailored regulation, right? That banks at different sizes and different scales and different reaches we should have different expectations for how they operate and how they present in communities. And that's a lot of what our conversation is. And so I'll start with that. The question of should people and individuals have a direct relationship with the U.S. Central Bank is a very, very deep one. Like that is not the relationship that the central bank has today. Today, the central bank is relevant in economic markets mainly by providing funds, money, cash, into the system through the banking system, and by facilitating a safe and sound financial system, that's our regulatory and financial stability stuff, and by facilitating payments. So we have a lot of hardware to make sure that people can do direct deposit, that ACH transfers happen, that wire transfers happen, that when you go to Target, those credit card and debit card transactions happen without you having to wait the 3 days that it would ordinarily take to figure out whether you have enough money in your account. There's a bunch of background stuff that we do. And the fact that most people don't know that is a sign of tremendous success. Yeah. Nobody thinks about this at all. It's actually one of the very significant values that we provide. We do all of that without anyone having an account with us. And this issue about should people have accounts with us comes up a lot when it comes to central bank digital currency and those sort of issues around like if you want to digitize. Here's the thing. Once people have accounts with us, we can actually know what they do. Like everything that they do. I'm not going there, right? Because that touches on so many other things beyond just the direct issue. It's sort of like, What does privacy mean? What can the government do? What's information share? Like all those things, and those are not things that we have jurisdictions to make decision on. Right? Those are things that Congress has to do, other agencies run those things. And so if that is where we're going to go, that is a much, much, much bigger conversation. Right? And so I don't think that's going to happen in the next year, next 6 months. Like, that's not where we're going to be. But if we want to go that route, then a whole host of other parties have to be brought into the conversation. And we're going to have to create a different kind of structure for what America is, because it will fundamentally change the relationship between citizens and their government. And so it's a very, very big question that I am not going to take lightly. And I'm actually not even going to tread into unless someone tells me I absolutely have to. All right.
Okay. Kate, where is your first dollar?
Well,
Unions, child credits.
I mean, I think you could probably guess. I also wish we got a chance to ask questions, because I have one if you want to somehow fold it into your final remarks. The 2% target became, like, I really focused on it a lot during inflation, because I think there's evidence that shows that the inflation target could be significantly higher, 3 to 5%, and be consistent with economic growth and real wage growth. So just putting that out there. What do you think about the 2% target? But what would I do myself, sort of, if I was the queen of the American economy? I think worker power, I mean, it's going to be always what I focus on. I think it has a really important dynamic effect. So it is going to address some of these issues around what workers get paid, the conversation about whether income is sufficient to change wealth. There's evidence that unions do lead to wealth building power, particularly for workers from marginalized groups. It has an even greater impact on their ability to gain wealth if they're union members. I just think sort of the ability for workers to exercise voice, the ability of workers to be protected from retaliation through unions is just, it's huge. It does so much for the economy. It just changes the dynamics of how the entire economy functions. So I also can't lobby in my position at the Urban Institute, but I would say to someone in Congress, something like the PRO Act, that was just not me saying you should pass the PRO Act, but something like that eases the path to unionization, or business neutrality. I think businesses play a big role in this. I know it's really hard to convince businesses to be pro-union, nor do I think that even necessarily makes sense in collective bargaining processes, but neutrality towards unions I think would be huge from the business side as well.
Your first dollar, Tony.
My first dollar, i.e. what policy things would I pick?
Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm a broken record on retirement, so I would certainly
right
fix that, because I think that is a very powerful and affordable thing to do. I also did a lot of work on minimum wage, as you know, and concluded that minimum wage could be way higher, and that would actually be good for business and good for the economy as well as good for workers. So I'm a big believer in taking that 7.25 to like 20 or 25 way up, well above living wage. I realize that there's transition. We can get into that, but I think the research shows that's actually good for the economy, very good for the economy, and good for the businesses that have to pay minimum wage. So I think the research is compelling on that. I would like to. I love that you're addressing the benefit cliff and getting people on a career track so that they actually develop skills and money. And I think all those kinds of barriers, and a lot of them can be self-funding, I think, which is I think what Dr. Bostic was saying. And 2/3 of the unemployed African Americans in New York have a criminal record. I think and a lot of it for not very serious crimes. I think there should be expunging criminal records, and there's a lot of societal barriers to things that are easy and cheap to do. Licenses, I think, perpetuate actually income inequality in a big way. And so I think we need to look at licenses which are sort of there to perpetuate the haves, not necessarily to protect the public. And it's gone, and the number of employers that work under licenses has gone up by, I think, 4 or 5-fold in the last 40 years. I know this is not $1. I also think that there should be a federal program. Somehow we should encourage people to furlough workers, keep them on, not lay them off, because I think the layoff and then the back is so disruptive, and it's so destructive of savings and retirement and everything else. And I think there should be programs, which is essentially what happened in COVID, where companies were encouraged to keep workers on. And so I think we need to do, as a society, we need to do something about that. So there's lifelong employment. You continue to develop skills. You continue to develop savings. You continue to stay in benefit programs, and so on and so forth. We need to be better at that. Europe's better than that than we are. We need to be better than that. So those are some of the ones that would jump to my mind.
There is no silver bullet. That's thing one. And it's a mistake to try to think that there is. And actually, it is antithetical to achieving what it is we need to achieve. At our core, people want to be self-determining and productive. That is part of the definition of freedom. That is part of the definition of justice. And an economy should serve that purpose. So under that frame, education, income, jobs, wealth, they're all critical and important. And government has a fiduciary. So this speaks to what President Bostic described. We do need a different relationship with government. We need industrial policy, and we're always engaged in industrial policy. Don't think that this is a new period of industrial policy. Government is always engaged in strategically directing resources towards aspects of our economy in an intended productive sense. So we need industrial policy that centers people and place always, and it needs to be done in an anti-racist way. We need to recognize that when we design, implement, and manage these interventions, they have to be intentionally inclusive, because the default in America is racist. So we need to come to grips with that. So when we lead with the discussion of a lower return at a higher cost, that just that is a structure. So for justice, we need investments in people in place, and we need to do it in an intentionally inclusive way.
You're two big things now you get.
Yeah, so I often bristle at what's the one thing that, like, I hate one thing questions. They always, because as Darrick said, there's never just one thing. Like what's the one thing that made you successful? It's like, yeah. So anyway, I guess what I would say is when I think about where our bank has been and where we are trying to be present, it is really trying to make sure that the employment infrastructure in every place is coherent. And for the U.S., we have not really focused very much on an employment infrastructure. When I think about employment infrastructure, that's one where everybody gets the skills to be their best self. It's one where we know collectively what jobs we need to be maximally productive. And we also have an information set so everybody knows what those things are, so that the community can all point in one direction and understand that every dollar they spend is actually moving to a place that is going to get those things to be the outcome. I actually like the way Darrick talked about it at the end. We have a tagline, an economy that works for everyone. Right? That's what we're trying to create, and that is, in my remarks, I said, look, we're trying to get every person to be at their maximum productivity, because if they do that, they're going to get their highest wage, they're going to be most self-determining, they're going to know where they can have their biggest value add, and then our economy winds up being bigger, it winds up being more resilient, it winds up being more inclusive, and more innovative, all those things, because we don't know where the next great idea is coming from, right? And if we don't have an economy that works for everyone, we're going to miss some of those great ideas. And one thing I've seen through my career is that oftentimes the great idea comes from an unexpected place. Mm-hmm. So if you just do things that serve the usual suspects, in whatever context they are, you're missing stuff. And as the world gets more and more competitive, more and more aggressive, more and more difficult, we less and less can afford to miss stuff, right? And so that's sort of the big picture I have. The other thing that I've tried to say is that this loss is not just for those people, right? This loss is for all of us. So if we don't do this well, we all are worse off. And that is another part of, in economics, we don't often acknowledge that part. We don't talk about sort of the collective welfare. There are theorems and things that do that. Economists don't actually talk about them very much. This is one of my little soapbox things. We could be talking about that, to say this is all of our interest, but we don't. And it means that the range of things that we think about, the range of possibilities we consider is just narrower than it should be, and the upside potential on it is lower than it could be. And those are all problems. I could talk about the 2% thing. It's not that interesting a tale. I mean, at a very basic level, 0% inflation is a problem. Too high inflation is a problem. Because if people feel like because if it's too high and 2 years from now, you need to get a lot of extra return, then the set of investments that make sense is just smaller, right? So you want something kind of in the middle. 2%, they picked, my predecessors picked 2%, I was not in the room. But it's a question you can have. What I would say is, in the middle of a crisis or before you have solved the crisis, that's not the time to change a benchmark. Because people will say, look, they just moved the goalposts. They didn't really do it. And so this is not a time to, I'm happy to actually, for us to have that conversation, but not today. Right? Today, inflation is going to 2%. Right? And if you leave with nothing else, that's what you need to know.
Okay. And it couldn't have happened without you three being good sports and doing it. Thank you. And it really wouldn't have happened without you, because I think now we're dedicated to in-person events. It changes everything. Imagine if this was on Zoom. Just imagine what it would feel like. So thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot.